Hello, everyone. I hope that you are doing well. I wanted to wish you a happy long Labor Day weekend and touch in on our course and a couple of things that we have already done this semester. So, before I get into what we are doing for next week, I wanted to do just a quick recap of our discussion board. First off, you guys did a wonderful job. I hope that email on all of the APA wisdom helped. Really, what I'm looking for, just to reiterate, is that you are appropriately citing your sources. That can be difficult sometimes, so I don't require you to go digging too deep. So again, if you can't find those authors and or the correct publication date, then you can just write the name of the article or the name of the source as I listed it in the library. But just know that if you are taking a heavier research class, that you would do some more work in terms of APA style. But for this course, it's not super important as long as you're telling me where you're getting your information. So, this week's case study, several of you guys actually mentioned this in your responses. It is unfortunately a very common experience for a assistant principal, an administrator, the principal, to have this assumption that gifted children do not need any additional services. And in this case, it's odd when you look at the situation, but their reasoning is, well, the students are doing really well on these standardized tests. They're in the 95th percentile. They've got high GPAs. They don't need anything else. That's really indicative of looking at students in terms of what do I need to fix, instead of looking at students and thinking, how can I further challenge them and how can I further serve them. So when we get into the module on what we call invisible gifted, we'll talk about a deficit versus a dynamic mindset. And this situation is very indicative of not having a dynamic mindset. So the principal is just saying, well, these students are doing great on these standardized tests. They don't need anything else. When actually, and several of you mentioned this, actually Allison quoted it pretty directly and said that the 95th percentile does not mean they're being challenged. Actually, the fact that these students are scoring in the 95th percentile is probably mostly indicative that they are not being challenged. So if we look at where and how these tests are normed, the standardized test is normed against on grade level ninth graders. So the fact that they are in the 95th percentile or the top 5% shows that they already know the majority of the content. And if they know the majority of the content, then they are not being challenged. So a lot of you guys did a really good job unpacking the validity of using standardized test scores to be the sole indicator, in this case, of giftedness. And I was happy to see that you were not happy with that. Cynthia wrote in her post that one test may not be the best indicator of giftedness. She pointed back to that federal definition that really reminds us that giftedness goes beyond just high ability. Several of you did that in your post. You talked about the fact that giftedness is more than just high intellectual capacity. It also includes those components of creativity and task commitment that Renzulli would quote. And also, if we think about Gardner's multiple intelligences, it goes way beyond just an academic ability, and we can see different avenues for students to be able to express those unique gifts that they may have. Christina wrote that the students have only mastered the standards already set for them, which is a really great way of saying, they need more. They've already mastered these standards that we've given them, and therefore, if they're in that 95th percentile, that's just giving us more proof that they need to be further challenged. Eliza also did a good job by starting off her post by saying we need to define what giftedness is in the first place. Whenever I've done consulting work in gifted education, that's always where I start, because it's very dangerous to assume that we know what giftedness means. You will notice this as we go out throughout the class, that the American culture in general has a misunderstanding of what it means to be gifted. We think that giftedness just means we're smart and we don't need any extra help. And one of the reasons why I'm so strict on you guys quoting your sources is because it's easy, even as educators trained in this, myself included, to fall back on that. So when we look at the research, we see that gifted students are way more than smart. They have their own unique needs, they have their own unique interests, and all of their gifts and talents are very unique. So just because we have a group of gifted students does not mean that they are all the same. So the first point I wanted to reiterate that all of you did a really good job on was pointing out the validity of the tests. So when we think about validity, the way I explain this to my undergrads is we talk about taking like a BuzzFeed quiz for what should I do with my life, right? So the BuzzFeed quiz is 10 questions long, and it asks me about my favorite coffee and if I'd rather be a dog or a cat, and if I like cold brew or not. And then after those 10 questions, it gives me a result on what I should do for my entire life. So clearly those 10 questions are not an appropriate measure of what my career should be. That's validity, or a lack of validity in that case. And the same thing goes for the standardized tests. So yes, they are in the 95th percentile, but that does not mean that they don't need to be challenged. So the fact that they're in the 95th percentile on a test that is normed against other regular on grade level ninth graders, that is actually more evidence for the fact that these students need to be further challenged. And you guys did a really good job on emphasizing from the law that we require differentiated services. So it is important that these gifted students are appropriately served. So the first point, again, is we have this issue of validity. That leads to a lot of issues, right? So if we are just focused on making sure that all students are okay, making sure that all students are doing good enough, or in the teacher buzz language, closing a gap, like closing the achievement gap, what often happens when we focus on closing that gap is we miss out on the students who are already achieving well and they're already where they, quote, need to be, but they're not getting appropriately challenged to go further. So we actually have what we call an excellence gap as well. And that excellence gap is referring to, in the field of gifted education, we are, number one, not appropriately challenging students who are identified, and number two, we're not appropriately identifying. So you'll see in later modules that we have a lot of issues of underrepresentation in gifted education because we have an assumption about what giftedness looks like, and that assumption often leads for us to misrepresent certain students in our gifted education programs. So I know achievement gap is an important buzzword for many of you. You may or may not have heard of the excellence gap, but clearly now that you're taking this class, it is equally important. When we have this excellence gap, we are not appropriately serving our most talented and brightest students. And who was it? Oh, Maggie. Maggie did a great job of saying, okay, if these students are not stimulated, then they're bored. And what do bored students do? They misbehave. So oftentimes our most gifted students are actually our worst behaved students. And that's simply because they're bored. They want nothing to do with the class because they already know all of the information. Think about going into a class where you already know 95% of the material. You are not going to do the easy worksheet. And if you do it, you're going to turn it in, and it's going to be very mediocre. One of you wrote mediocre. I like to give credit where it's due. Who wrote mediocre? Okay, that person deserves credit. One of you wrote in your discussion post that oftentimes these gifted students will start to turn in mediocre work in terms of the regular education classroom. And again, that's because of that lack of stimulation. So I wanted to point that out because oftentimes when we think about gifted students, we don't think that they are in the back of the classroom misbehaving. We think they are in the front of the classroom eager to learn, which is the very stereotypical view of a gifted child. But due to this excellence gap and the fact that they are not being appropriately challenged, we often realize that the most highly gifted students are likely to be also the ones that are really misbehaving. So I wanted to make sure that I discussed the fact that a lack of services often leads to even underachievement, and if not underachievement, it definitely leads to boredom. And all of us practicing teachers know what happens when kids are bored. So that's a problem, and not just in terms of we don't want misbehaving students, but we want to make sure that our students are appropriately served. The last thing that I wanted to mention, and several of you guys did a good job picking this out, is that giftedness is way more than just this intellectual capacity. So several of you guys mentioned, okay, we're looking at the students' reading scores and the students' math scores, but we have theories and definitions of giftedness that bring up components like leadership. If you think back to Renzulli, the 3-ring model, we have creativity, we have task commitment. If you think of multiple intelligences, what about students who are perhaps like kinesthetically gifted? And we are not considering those components of giftedness if we're only defining giftedness based on their reading and their math scores. So a lot of you guys did a really good job proposing that the principal has a narrow view of what it means to be gifted. I did want to point out this is a very common problem. I don't like sweeping statements, but I would say the most common problem that I've witnessed in gifted education is a lack of alignment between the identification and the services that are provided. So for example, some gifted programs are really into identification. So they will identify based on these multiple intelligences. So they'll say this person is kinesthetically gifted, this person is visuospatially gifted, and it seems really great. At first glance, educators are excited because it does more than just identify for the academically gifted. But then you look at the services provided and they're like, you can either take AP English or AP Math. Okay, that's a problem. If you are identified as a gifted student because of your kinesthetic ability, then you should not then be placed into an AP English class. So we have a lack of alignment or a mismatch, and that is a very common issue. If we think about Mr. Taylor in this situation, the parents are advocating that the students take AP English, which is great. However, what if the students really need to be challenged in math because that's where their gift lies? So I just wanted to make sure that I pointed that mismatch out because this is a big issue between identification and services. And several of you mentioned, well, we need to remember that giftedness is more than just academic ability or more than just reading and math. But before we start identifying beyond that, we need to make sure that we have the appropriately matched services to serve those children. A lot of times in gifted education, we have researchers and teachers who are focused on one of those two. So we focus on getting students identified for programming, but then we don't really follow up and see what type of services are provided. Or the reverse happens. We have teachers who are just given the gifted students and they don't know how they were identified in the first place. So one thing I would encourage you to do within your school setting is look into how are these students identified in the first place. I have these students that are gifted. What does that actually mean? Because as you see, and actually I want to quote Kayla on this. Kayla said that the definition of giftedness is the foundation of our gifted program. So the definition of giftedness is the foundation of our gifted program. That is a beautifully crafted statement that is not always true, and it should always be true. But the way that we are identifying gifted students and defining these gifted students should be the way that we're also serving them. So hopefully you're seeing that this is a lot more complicated than you thought. And even issues like this case study show that when we have a misunderstanding of what it means to be gifted, if we go back to that myths versus realities quiz, then if we have a misunderstanding, then we're also going to misidentify, and then we're also going to do a disservice. So everything is built on these assumptions, which is why it's so important to start a conversation in terms of giftedness with a definition. So make sure that whoever you're talking to, is on the same page as you are in terms of what gifted means. That doesn't mean you in terms of this is what I think giftedness is. It means you in terms of I can quote the research on this. So there's my soapbox. We are going to jump straight in this week to one of my favorite assignments, because now that you have some information, you're going to look back at that myths and reality survey. Okay, this week is just an assignment, so you won't have a discussion post or responses due this week. But now that you have read some initial content and we've started to dig into everything, I want you to go back to that myths and the myths and reality survey, and you're going to write a reflection on it. Okay, this is all posted on Blackboard, but I just wanted to reiterate the three things that I'm looking for. Number one, which of the items that you answered incorrectly at that moment, which of those surprised you the most? If there was one question that you were just kind of blown away by, you can just choose one. If there were 5 questions that you got wrong and they all surprised you, you can choose all 5. That's fine. Just tell me which of the ones you were most surprised by. Number 2, are there any common themes among the items that you answered correctly? And how can these common themes guide you as you continue in class? So, for example, a lot of the questions were based on appropriate educational services for the gifted. A lot of you guys were surprised by acceleration and how effective that can be. That's a common theme. Some of the questions were more focused on social and emotional needs. Maybe that is what surprised you. So the difference between the first and the second bullet is, first you're just telling me, hey, these are the questions I missed. This is why I was surprised. And the second bullet, you're kind of digging deep into that and wondering, is there some kind of common thread between all of these questions that I missed? And then after that, I want you to think about what is that one topic related to gifted education that I'm excited to explore more about. So after reflecting on this and seeing, hey, I got these questions wrong and I'm understanding why, what is it that you really hope we address within this class? Within this assignment, I would encourage you to go back to your library resources. If you're using any of those sources to combat what you thought to be true that actually wasn't, then make sure that you cite your sources. There's a rubric on Blackboard that you can view that will show you exactly how I plan to grade this assignment. But really what I'm looking for is for you to start to think about those underlying themes about what you view to be giftedness and how some of that may be based on some kind of misunderstanding, and how that can guide you from now throughout the rest of the semester. I'll tell you mine. I'm always really intrigued by social and emotional needs of gifted. I was identified as gifted not right away, but later in elementary school. And I remember no one ever told me what it meant. And so I had a very misunderstanding of what it meant to be gifted. And then as I started to study giftedness later in life, I didn't realize that there were a lot of needs that went along with being gifted. I thought gifted just meant that you had to be smart and on top of things. So that's a common theme for me, and that drives me to continue to research the needs of gifted students. So just to reiterate, for this week, you only have your one assignment, and that is your myths survey reflection, and that needs to be uploaded on Blackboard by Sunday evening. The next week, we'll start digging into characteristics of gifted children, one of my favorite modules and definitely my favorite case study, so I'm excited for you guys to look at that. I should be posting your grades for your discussion posts, but if you have any questions in the meantime, you know how to contact me. Okay, I hope you've had a wonderful weekend, and I will touch base soon.